Good evening, everyone. My name is Antonia Wunderlich, and on behalf of the British-German Association, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this evening's event. For those of you who are joining us for the first time today, the British-German Association is a charity and membership organisation that promotes mutual understanding and good relations between the UK and Germany. Part of what we do is to provide a vibrant forum for debates, talks, discussions, and learning about Germany and British-German relations. So we regularly put on events such as this one, along with other initiatives such as our monthly newsletter and podcast series. Today's event will be a timely conversation on Germany's security and defence policy. And we are delighted to welcome our distinguished guest speakers, Dr. Claudia Major, the head of the International Security Division at the German Institute for International and Security Affairs in Berlin, Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, and Professor Simon Green, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at Aston University. Simon will be moderating this evening's conversation. Before handing over to Claudia, a quick note on the technology. We encourage you to submit your questions throughout the event, as Simon will be taking questions after Claudia's introductory remarks. So please send in any queries via the Q&A function, which you should be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. If you click on it, you can start typing up and sending in questions. And you have the option to like someone else's question. And the more likes a question gets, the higher it goes up on the list. So on that note, over to you, Claudia.
Thank you. Thank you, and I'm really delighted to be here. And I have to say, I'm particularly delighted to be here with Simon. And I'm going to tell you a secret, because Simon was my PhD supervisor. So if I'm here and if I'm able to talk about those topics, this is to a large extent thanks to Simon, who prepared me and equipped me on my way into academia and the think tank life. Having said that, if you're not happy with what I'm saying, or if I say any stupid things, that's only me. It's not Simon. So the good things for Simon, the criticism to me. German defense policy. I would like to make 3 brief points. The first is, and I'm going to concentrate on what has happened over the last 4 weeks, 6 weeks in German security and defense policy. 3 brief points. The first is the traditional German approach up until the 24th of February. The second, Zeitenwende, what is it all about? And the third brief conclusion is, and now, how we are going to continue. So let me start with what I would call a very traditional German approach until the 24th of February, so when the Russian invasion started. The approach that Germany chose actually until the start of the war very much reflected our very much compromise-driven German political system, our lack of foreign policy principles, and the absence of a military threat perception. What I mean with compromise, we have a government composed of 3 parties, the Greens, the Liberals, and the Social Democrats. That means we have compromise in the coalition treaty, that's the government program, and we have compromise in all political decisions. The focus of that government was on domestic politics, Corona, climate change, and many other issues. There wasn't really a focus on foreign security or defense policies. And that was actually very visible in the first reaction of Germany to the crisis in Ukraine and the Russian buildup, the Russian military buildup at the border to Ukraine. To a certain extent, it seemed that the stability in the 3-party coalition and the cohesion of that government seemed to be far more important than having a real clear-cut position on Russia and Ukraine. And it's also difficult, it was difficult for the government to really position itself because Germany is lacking priorities in its foreign policy principles. Germany has at least 6 principles or 6 priorities, goals in its foreign policy. It wants to avoid war at all cost. Second, it wants to safeguard European unity. Third, it wants to be a good ally. And fourth, it wants to limit the use of military force and defense exports, considered to be evil. Fifth, it wants dialogue with Russia. There's this old mantra, particularly in the German social democracy, there's no security without Russia. And 6, it wants to defend German economic interest, and that includes protecting energy supplies that are important for the German economy. In peace times, you can have all those 6 principles next to each other. In times of crisis or war, as we have now, Germany had to recognize that those objectives are not only interconnected, but to a certain extent, they are mutually exclusive. You can't be a good ally and maintain good relationship with Russia that is waging war in Europe. And that was a rather painful learning process. And up until the war started, 24th of February, Germany was sending mixed messages to its allies. And those allies questioned Germany's reliability. Germany was considered being too soft on Russia, didn't really put Nord Stream 2 on the table. Germany was not supportive enough of Ukraine, was considered to be a little bit not really committed. So, and Germany didn't accept to deliver weapons and didn't question the kind of unconditional energy relationship it had with Russia. So for the eyes of many allies, there was a big question mark. Where do you actually stand? How reliable you are? There was one famous Wall Street Journal op-ed that asked in the title, is Germany a reliable ally? And the answer was 9. So there was a big question mark to what extent Germany was actually on the right side. The hesitation was also due to the fact that since the end of the Cold War, Germany has never really felt threatened in a military way. Germany felt threatened by many things, migration, climate change, economic developments, but not really militarily. And that also meant that Germany wasn't really committed to improve its military or to engage in military operations in the post-Cold War war. And when Germany did commit in military terms, for example, together with France and Mali, or with NATO at the eastern NATO flank after the annexation of Crimea in 2014, it did so to a large extent out of solidarity with its closest partners, France and Mali, NATO allies in NATO, but not really because it felt militarily so threatened. So if you take that perspective, it's understandable why Germany, until the invasion started on 24th of February, focused on diplomacy because it served us well, was reluctant to deliver weapons, and didn't really engage in the kind of military dimension of that conflict. Germany didn't want to jeopardize its economic relationship with Russia, symbolized by Nord Stream 2, and it didn't really put into danger its economic interest. And that brings me to my second point. This all changed with the invasion of 24th of February. 3 days after that invasion, on 27th of February, Chancellor Scholz gave a speech where he declared a so-called Zeitenwende. I say declared because we are far away from implementation so far. If it were to be implemented, it would fundamentally change German security and defense policy. It's still too early to assess it, but it would be a fundamental change. Zeitenwende, what does it mean? Zeitenwende, for me, comprises 3 elements. It's disruption. It's a disruption change. It's not a change that Germany decided. It's a change that has come upon or has been imposed by Russia on Germany. Many of our Central and Eastern European partners kind of said, we told you so. We warned you about the Russian ambitions. But Germany felt on that speech the Chancellor made on the 27th of February that this was a disruption that came in a kind of almost brutal way over Germany. The second element of Zeitenwende is there is something before and there is something afterwards. And something before is a cooperative peace order in Europe since the end of the Cold War and unification up until now, in which Germany could develop well, from which Germany benefited greatly in economic terms. It was a cooperative security order agreed with Russia in treaties like the Charter of Paris, the Helsinki Final Act, or the NATO-Russia Founding Act, and where Germany was convinced that we have a halfway agreed security order together with Russia, which worked. Germany didn't really realize that Russia was rather unhappy with that security order for many reasons. So from a German perspective, that was a comfortable order that served us well. And this ended with the invasion in Ukraine. And now we enter a new era of a confrontational security order, not longer with Russia in Europe, but against Russia, which means a total mindset change for Germany. And the third element, and which is for me the most important one of Zeitenwende, is to recognize that this is about us. For the first time, Germany feels militarily threatened. This war is at a 2 hours flight from Berlin. The refugees arrive at the city center of Berlin, at the central station, with something like 5 minutes from the Chancellery. From a German perspective, for the first time, it feels this is a threat to our way of doing things, our freedom, our political system, the whole thing we have constructed in Germany and Europe. And this is a major shift. I said earlier that many of the security policy decisions were largely out of solidarity, but not because Germany felt militarily threatened. And this has changed. This war, this aggression is perceived as Russia bombing away a security order that served Germany well, and it's threatening the very system we have built in Europe. And this element of this is about us. There's a real threat to us, actually enabled the Chancellor to take decisions that were unthinkable before. Really not small decisions, but really decisions in the area of security and defense and foreign policy, which were unthinkable before. What do I mean? It's first economic sanctions on an unprecedented scale, including against Nord Stream 2, this controversial pipeline, thereby abandoning the almost unconditional energy partnership with Russia, delivering weapons to Ukraine, something that Germany refused before, and defense. In defense, Germany promised to now spend 2% on defense, something it had promised to NATO already, but never really delivered. Increasing the German defense budget to 2% would mean an increase from currently 50 billion to almost 75 billion. That's an enormous jump in the defense spending. It would turn Germany into the biggest defense spender in Europe, far away from Britain and France. And Germany also announced a special budget of 100 billion euros for big procurement items, things like a new fighter plane F-35 to do the nuclear role in NATO, a heavy transport helicopter, or a joint aircraft project with France and Spain. Each of that decisions, delivery arms to Ukraine and the energy partnership, spend 2%, 100 billion special budget, the big, very often debated controversial projects like buying the F-35 or armed drones, each decision would be a tiny revolution on its own. And on that speech on the 27th of February, Scholz made a whole list of those. If they were implemented, they would really change Germany's place in Europe and German foreign policy. To conclude, how sustainable is that change? I think the biggest task that Germany is facing is not something that you can announce on a Sunday morning in a speech. The speech of Scholz was on a Sunday morning on a special session of the parliament, because it's a mindset change. It's to recognize that power politics are back, that Germany has a role to play in European security and defense, and that if Germany is strong, also other European countries can be enabled in political and in security and defense terms. So Germany has a responsibility for maintaining peace and security in Europe. We have already debates coming back in Germany about, is this a militarization of German foreign policy? Shouldn't we engage with Russia? Have we been too harsh? So the question is, how sustainable is the announced change? And to what extent Germany is really recognizing that we have the end of this cooperative security order, and that we enter a confrontational security order that will be less comfortable than we used to have it in the past, and where will we be not in peace with Russia and China, but rather in an ongoing conflict in many areas, be it the information, cyber, or others. So to really recognizing that we enter a new phase. And Germany's contribution to that European repositioning, it's not only about Germany repositioning, it's a European repositioning in that confrontational security order is crucial in political terms, because Germany can create to a certain extent unity with other European countries. It can motivate other European countries. In economic terms, Germany remains a powerhouse and can be a leader on green economy, on climate change, on diversification of energy and all that. And in defense terms, if Germany spent this big defense budget wisely, it can become the important conventional backbone for deterrence and defense in Europe, and can make sure that NATO remains the life assurance for all allies. So if we get this right, that can really be an enabling factor for the rest of Europe. And I said Europe and not European Union, as you might have realized. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Claudia, for these very precise and but also very thought-provoking introductory comments. You covered an awful lot of ground there in just 15 minutes, but so thank you. That's really helpful. I've already seen a few questions coming in, which is good, and I will come to those soon. But I'm going to abuse my position as chair just to kind of start off with a couple of things where I really was interested, actually, just to invite you to unpack things a little bit more. And there's two things which kind of really strike me about what you said, because this whole, first of all, you talked about the dialogue with Russia as being one of the strategic priorities for Germany, and indeed, you know, we all know that there are a number of sections of German public opinion who have always prided themselves on being effective interlocutors between Russia and Germany. The interesting thing for me, the question for me, and I really this is where I want to come to with you on this one, is how, what word did they miss? It's like they, did they just not understand what we're actually dealing with Putin? Because it does appear that quite a lot of what we have seen with Russia is kind of Putin really kind of hiding in plain sight. And so, given that there were so many people who were much vaunted interlocutors, how come they didn't spot it?
I think there's I mean, if I talk now with many European partners and colleagues, very often there was a first phase of kind of marveling at this Zeitenwende decisions. And now, almost 6 weeks later, there's a certain irritation, if I might say, about what we are doing with it. And there is this kind of, your Zeitenwende thingy is inward looking. You talk about you, Germany, what you didn't get on Russia, what you missed, how you have to reorganize, and how a painful learning process that is. But if Zeitenwende is about Germany repositioning itself, you should care a little bit about your partners. It shouldn't be a kind of introspective, domestic soul searching. You should play a role. And I come to your question in a second, and that means there's a certain, I would almost say, deception to say, okay, you will spend so much more on defense, but now it's about helping Ukraine. And we have two key decisions to take if we want to support Ukraine. It's an energy embargo and it's delivering weapons. Germany, where are you on those two questions? It's nice to spend 2%. It's nice to have 100 billion special budget. But what we need now from you is leadership on those two questions. So I think my fear is that this initial kind of, wow, you're finally waking up, is turning into a, oh God, they mess it up. What did they miss? And this is linked to what did they miss on Russia? After unification, there was a deep belief in Germany and the foreign policy elites and in the Social Democrats, who have been the most supportive of this talking to Russia approach. There was a deep belief that the peaceful end of German separation and the peaceful unification somehow means that the democratic system prevails, somehow won the historical competition, and that it will be the system that will actually win in a long-term perspective. And that if we only cooperate closely enough with other countries, Russia, China, they will become like us, and we will have a kind of peaceful transformation as we had in Germany. This idea of a convergence theory was very prominent in Germany. And we thought if we only cooperate closely enough with Russia and have enough dialogue, they will become like us. They will become politically democratic. They will, in economic terms, become liberal, have liberal systems. And on the international level, they will become responsible actors like us in the UN and everywhere else. There have been many warning moments. The war in Georgia, 2008, the war in Ukraine, 2014, the Russian interventions in Syria and in Libya. But it didn't really fit the picture. So there were the warnings, but there was still the hope, no, we have to cooperate again, and we have to listen, and we have to find an agreement. So this is one element, this kind of recognizing that the recipes we had in mind failed. It's never easy to recognize that something we really believed in failed. And there was also, I think, to a certain extent, if we realize that Russia is that revanchist, aggressive, war-waging neighbor, we would take conclusions from that, consequences. That would mean we diversify our energy market, we stop trading with Russia, we invest more in our military. But so far, Russia kept its aggressions below the threshold of war, and that allowed many Germans to just not see it. So I think to a certain extent, it was, we don't want to see what would bring harsh consequences for us.
Thanks, Claudia, and this actually links in quite neatly, I think, to the first questions I wanted to take up from the Q&A which have come up here. Mark Wood has, for instance, asked about the question of sending advanced weapons to the Ukraine. So far, it all appears to be old ex-GDR stock, and what is there a hesitancy around delivering more modern weapons? And Vladimir Handel has, hello Vladimir, has asked about a similar question about, for instance, supplying Ukraine with the Marder vehicles, which are about to be decommissioned and which are still standing in a nice little row somewhere. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah. So far, the line of NATO has been no direct military intervention of the alliance in Ukraine, because that would be a risk of war. And a war with Russia, between Russia and NATO, would lead to an even bigger catastrophe than we already have. So the line of the NATO states so far was no direct military intervention with a no-fly zone or something else, but below that, do as much as we can to support Ukraine. With weapons delivery, with delivering protection kits against biological and chemical weapons and all that. In addition, each ally can do on a bilateral level what they want to do. NATO states, as many others, initially thought that this war would be a short war. So the focus was on delivering old Soviet-style equipment, which Ukraine can use directly because they don't need to learn how to use it. We had a debate whether Poland would deliver its old MiG fighting jets to Ukraine because the Ukrainian Air Force used those same MiGs, so they could use it directly and actually gain or kind of improve their air superiority. What we see now, particularly after the massacres we have seen in Bucha, we have a little movement in those debates. And we have movement in two directions. The first direction is that now NATO countries and Western countries think about delivering heavier stuff. Slovakia or Czech Republic actually delivered tanks, old Soviet tanks, but tanks. So we are moving from this just Stinger and Javelins up to bigger, heavier equipment. That's the first development. And the second development, which I find really interesting, we have an increasing debate about if this war is going to take longer than we all think. We might have the time to train Ukrainian soldiers on Western systems and in parallel build the maintenance, logistical and technical structure they would need to actually operate those Western systems. And one example for those Western systems would be the Marder. The idea was actually to deliver the functional Marders to Ukraine and to refurbish those old style Marders, which are waiting somewhere, refurbish them and give them to the Bundeswehr. And the Bundeswehr would directly deliver functional Marder to Ukraine. And that's an interesting one, because if we really say this war is taking longer and we enable Ukraine also with Western system, that could make a difference. The question is, do we, if there is really the agreement that Russia should not win that war, and it should not even have a tiny success in that war, then we should do far more to support Ukraine, not only to defend itself, but actually to reconquer the regions that Russia has occupied in the moment. Also because we have seen in Bucha and in Mariupol what's happening to the regions that Russia is occupying. And if we are serious about that, we should think in those two directions: more heavy stuff, artillery, air defense, and thinking about training Ukrainian soldiers on Western systems. And I myself, I can say that so openly, disappointed that Germany is not being more forward-leaning on this military support.
That's, I mean, that's, I want to come to energy in a minute, Claudia, but that's a really important point, isn't it? Because it's about, what we're seeing, of course, is Ukraine has effectively become it's a fully mobilized country now. It is on a complete war footing, whereas, of course, Russia isn't so far. It's still a special operation. But in that context, if you are in that kind of context as a country, it's not always, bless you, it's not always going to be easy just to get your basics as well as the armaments. It's stuff like fuel, stuff like power, ammunition, the kind of, you know, the and food, and obviously, and is that something which is where Germany is does it feel more comfortable with some of these things, for instance, providing fuel?
On the one hand, yes. I mean, if you look at what the Ukrainians need, fuel is really high on the list, because Russia was bombarding the storage facilities. So it really needs fuel, and it needs also things like transportation means to transport that fuel from A to B. So there are actually things where Germany could do more. Germany could also do far more, for example, on things like mine mapping. Russians put mines very much in the areas they occupied, and just actually signaling where they are, so to protect the civilian population. Germany could do far more. Germany could also do something in the documentation of war crimes. There's a certain experience and a certain knowledge due to the Balkan Wars and Africa. So Germany could do far more on those, what you would call a little bit less controversial topics. On the other hand, so yes, there is a way, also humanitarian support, from buses to shelter to water and all that. Huh? On the other hand, I mean, if we are serious about Zeitenwende, and if we say this is really something that has fundamentally challenged our beliefs, our core beliefs, and we think this is a danger not only to Ukraine, but to Europe, to freedom, democracy, and all those things, then shouldn't we be a bit more serious? Not only about spending 2% and 100 billion, which is great things. I mean, I'm all in favor, but this is inward looking. This is us. So shouldn't we be more serious about weapons delivery and the energy questions? And this is a question our partners are asking now. Where are you on those questions? So that's why I think, yes, we can do far more on the lower end, but why are we shying away from the higher end?
Thanks. And that's, I think, is a great opportunity to segue into the question of energy, which, unsurprisingly, some of the participants have been asked questions around. And Mike Bright is asking about European energy sharing. Jackie Newbury, hello Jackie, is making the point about whether the economic and energy policy across all parties was it based on a mistake? I mean, it kind of harks back to that question of did people in Germany not actually understand, the elites in Germany, the interests in Germany not understand that they were actually riding on the back of a tiger?
Hi, Jackie. It's good to hear you, even if I don't see you. I think to a certain extent, it was a mistake. And just as a reminder, Nord Stream 2, this pipeline that never entered service but was already toxic just by being there, was launched in 2015. That was after the annexation of Crimea. And that's something where I tend to think we should have known better. But this comes back to what I mentioned earlier, this convergence theory, that idea that if we stay in dialogue, if we interact closely, we can prevent conflicts. I tend to think it was a mistake to be so unilaterally dependent on one country, but to a large extent we didn't want to see that, and it also fits in a little bit in this kind of Ostpolitik nostalgia from the Social Democrats, and it fits also into this little bit historical guilt that Germany still feels with regard to Russia and the Soviet Union due to the Second World War. What we see now is, and I find it really amazing to see the economics minister and energy minister Habeck now trying to reorganize the German energy dependency. And the Greens are the ones who also favor and call for norms-based foreign policy. And he went to Qatar to actually strike an energy deal. And you could see how difficult it is for him to say, now we do an energy partnership with Qatar because we made ourselves too dependent on Russia. So the big question that we have behind is, what do we learn from that dependency for our interaction with China in the future? Are we able now already to diversify, to think about supply chains, to think about raw materials, and be wiser to avoid to find ourselves again in that situation? Sorry.
It raises another interesting question, though, of course, about actually in the domestic German context, also about the future of nuclear power. I mean, we've seen the announcement in the UK today that actually we're going to build more nuclear power plants. And one of the reasons, after all, why Germany's CO2 levels, as we saw in COP26, are so high, of course, is because it's withdrawn from nuclear and actually gone down a fairly conventional fossil fuel pathway. So I wonder if you think that we're straying into energy policy here, obviously, Claudia, so forgive me on that one. But I mean, is this likely to see, and what would you can see from the Greens' perspective, that could be a very, very difficult one to swallow?
I don't have a crystal ball, but my gut feeling is that Germany, rather put it in a funny sentences, Germany goes rather to Qatar than going nuclear again. My impression is that the nuclear question is so sensitive, is so emotional, is so normative in Germany that this really would be a no-go for the government. They would rather really try to engage partnership with, I say, interesting partners like Qatar than to go back to the nuclear. I think this is really for the Green Party a no-go. I would say now, but who knows? But I think this is really, this debate has very quickly closed. I mean, we had it already before with the taxonomy question with France, where France tried to put nuclear energy into the kind of green list. So I think this is not something where this government is likely to move. Don't see it happen.
So that, of course, then raises another interesting question. And we talk about the Zeitenwende. I've got lots of questions. By the way, folks, keep them coming because they're really good. And I'm trying to weave them into the discussion as we go through that. And there's a lot of them which are forward-looking. So I do want to come to those in a minute. But it's that unpicking of actually when we talk about the Zeitenwende, there is this kind of sense that everybody in Germany is shouting hurrah. It's everybody agrees. It's exactly. I wonder if you might unpick a little bit about this, not just between the political parties here. There's obviously particular questions around the PDS, or the left party rather, but actually also around some of the economic interests which we're seeing. Because I'd be really interested in your sense of how much discord we might end up seeing there.
There were some, I mean, Scholz did his speech 27th of February, and there were some polls 2-3 days later. And there you could see an enormous support for the thing he announced. There was an enormous support for 2% defense spending, which we never had in the past. There was support for the special budget, which is surprising because military and defense issues remain highly controversial in Germany, and Germany remains a pacifist country with a really reluctance to the use of force for historical reasons. So having such a strong military focus is quite a thing in Germany. So having a kind of 70 or 80% support was really surprising. What would surprise me in that poll 2-3 days after the Scholz speech was another number, and that was more than 70% of the German population feared that this war might arrive in Europe and in Germany. And I think it is really what I meant earlier was this is about us, this fear that you have a war at a 2 hours flight time from Berlin, from cities who look a little bit like Germany, was really something that deeply affected the population. So initially there was a big support for the decisions announced. I'm skeptical how sustainable this support is. I think as soon as, first we can already see now a certain war fatigue. It has been going on for more than 6 weeks. It's not longer, it's still on the headlines, but not so much. And old dividing lines come back. Old dividing lines is, oh, if you spend so much money on defense, we can spend less on, say, green energy or others. For a long time, you had rather the idea we are willing to spend more on petrol. And now you have the debates, what will be the effect of higher energy prices, heating and petrol on the normal German citizen. So you have the old dividing lines slowly coming back and questioning the need and sense of Zeitenwende. You could see it in the political debates in the parliament over the last days. So I'm skeptical about the sustainability of change. You had the Italian Prime Minister Draghi, I think yesterday, saying, it's a very easy question. Do you want peace or you want air conditioning? And he clearly indicated what he thought was the right answer. I'm not sure how the question would be answered here.
And I think this again picks up, I think, a kind of question which Hidayat Chukoparan is putting in the chat around actually the appetite for the German population really to sustain quite significant costs involved. At the moment, Zeitenwende and the sanctions, for instance, is all still relatively abstract. But if you start really doing it properly and start having energy embargoes, there is going to be a cost. It may not be as much as people think, but nonetheless, it will be real.
I mean, we have the costs already. I mean, you feel it in Berlin with the fuel prices, for example. If you fill up your car, you feel it already, and you feel it in many other prices too. We have, I mean, Germany, Poland is taking most of the refugees, but then arrive very quickly in Germany. So even Berlin at the central station, and I think there's already an impression or kind of first idea of how what that would mean. I think what I would like to see is far more political, not only political kind of the government, not only defending what they decided with Zeitenwende, but going out in an active promotion of why we need it and why it's good to do it and why we accept to do more, why we need to spend more on certain things like defense, why we have to accept certain higher prices, and what does it mean in the long-term perspective. I think the Green Minister Habeck said something like, rather be dependent on 5 difficult states than on one difficult state who then can blackmail you. So kind of rethinking really what it means for us. I think we would need far more political encouragement and explanation actually on the decisions ahead, on the decisions that are likely to come at a certain point.
Okay, thanks. Now, I do want to move on to the questions which are around the future in the last 20 minutes, but there's one very technical question which I'm just going to put you from Robert Davis here, who's asked, and this may be beyond you're very talented, Claudia, and you can do many things, but this way, it may be require a technical level of expertise which you do not have, so feel free to say so. Is there a legal threshold when providing weapons which would elevate you to combatant status?
Actually, if you go to the legal system, normally you say you are combatant if you have ground forces, if you have forces on the ground in the area, which is not the case. Also, if you think about all these combatants who go there, let's say on a private basis, so you have volunteers from several European countries are apparently fighting in Ukraine. It doesn't mean the country from where they come participate in this war. There were Germans fighting for the Islamic State, or there were Germans fighting in Turkey, in Kurdistan. But as long as they don't follow rules coming from that country, in that case Germany, Germany is not considered kind of being part of the conflict. So the legal decision, the legal threshold would be we are sending ground forces to the conflict in Ukraine, or the people who are there from, say, Germany follow German command, which is not the case of the volunteers. That's the legal explanation. On the other hand, what we have seen in that war is that Putin doesn't care much about legal thresholds. This is starting this war was breaking international law. If you looked at the international humanitarian law, which gives the rules of a war, because also in a war you have rules and regulations, Russia is not paying attention to it. One of the kind of most important rules is that you don't attack civilians and civilian infrastructure. And that has happened in Ukraine several times, in Mariupol and in Bucha. So we stick to the legal framework. Russia doesn't. And if you come back to the question of when we become part of a kind of combat forces, so far Western countries haven't, but from a Russian perspective, we are already part of the conflict. When the Western countries launched the first economic sanctions, Russia responded by declaring that it put its deterrence forces, which include the nuclear weapons, on alert. So Russia responded to an economic initiative with a military security defense answer. So I think to a certain extent, it doesn't help us if we say we stick to the rules, if Russia doesn't care about the rules. If Russia wants to feel provoked or threatened, if Russia is looking for a reason to enlarge the conflict also to Western countries, it will find someone. It will not, it's unlikely to be connected to international law, I tend to think.
Okay. Very good answer there, Claudia. Thank you for that. Very detailed. So I've got some, look, if we're looking ahead now, there's some 3 questions which I've seen here on the chat, which I think would kind of cover some of the different areas, which are quite useful. And then perhaps we can come right at the end to Jackie, who has answered, as usual, the easy question, right? And we can get, that's some good opportunity to come right at the very end. I'll leave you to look that one up, Claudia. But so the first question here, which I wanted to come to, they kind of come together actually. It's from Gerd Hilgers, who's asking about the capacity that Germany has actually in terms of its central governance structures to be able to actually pursue this Zeitenwende, which I think is quite an interesting question, because in that sense, you know, the government structures and the capacities are actually, of course, designed for something completely different. And Melanie Schroeter, who's asked about a sense of whether there's any kind of sense of apprehensiveness about this change in German foreign policy to what might be termed a more traditional foreign policy, an assertive foreign policy.
So more, is Germany getting British, if I might translate? That's the question?
Your words, not mine.
Okay, and the first one was to what extent our political system is actually able to deliver a Zeitenwende?
Yeah.
Remembering me studying in Birmingham, I learned a lot about strategic culture. And strategic culture, to put it in very easy terms, is how a country behaves in security and defense and how it sees military force. And Germany has a very special relation to military force and to all things military, generally speaking. Normally, we say that the strategic culture, so the DNA of a country in foreign policy, changes over a generation. When Germany, after unification in 1990, our partners, international partners, said, okay, you are a nice country again, please help us in international security and defense operations. And Germany said, no, we don't do that. We learned our lesson from history. We don't do operations. We don't do military stuff except for NATO, but we don't go for any outside operations. And our Western partner said, no, it's okay, you can do it. We trust you. And Germany was really reluctant because it really had learned the lesson, never again and never alone. And we had big debates in Germany in the early 1990s, whether we could send military personnel to Cambodia or whether that would be okay. Now, some 30 years later, Germany is heading one of the multinational groups in the Baltic countries, of the multinational NATO troops, and is part of the deterrence and defense measures there. It was in Afghanistan, it was in Mali, and on the Balkans. So over 30 years, Germany has changed its defense policy already. But to move from that still special German approach, always embedded in international structures, preferring cooperation to unilateral action, to change that, I think, is a really, really, really long way to go. And I'm not sure actually what the goal of Germany foreign policy changing even more would be. I think if you look now, Germany is elaborating a national security strategy. It launched the process in March, and this first ever national security strategy is going to be ready at the end of the year or early next year. And it will be a first understanding, how do we see the world? What do we want to do, with whom and how? And I expect Germany to stick to this traditional guidelines of always be embedded in international structures, cooperate with partners, prime partner EU and NATO, and prefer non-military means to military means. If Germany can turn that into a reliable contribution to European security and defense, I'm all happy. So I think the kind of key premises are actually worth to be kept with a bit more reliability. To what extent can our political system deliver Zeitenwende? Good question. The question is what we put on the Zeitenwende. Is this the kind of big understanding that Germany has to do more in Europe, that the peaceful cooperative order is over and we enter into confrontation? Something that for me is really important is to understand that the opposite of war is not peace. We tend to think that once the war in Ukraine is over, there will be peace and everything will be fine again. This will not be the case. As I earlier said, we will enter into a permanent conflict with Russia and China, and a conflict that will be carried out in many areas, from cyber to economic, the information space, up to lower degree military conflict. To prepare a country for that would be difficult in a centralized country and in a federal country like ours. What it would need is a far bigger political engagements of the government and the parliamentarians with the population. And the national security strategy might actually be one process and one moment where you can engage in that learning process. I could go into more detail for the military realm that only throwing money at the Bundeswehr will not help us. We have to change the procurement system, and we have to change the way all those procurement system works. But I think that's being very technical. I think in the end, it's a political question. Is the government willing to push that change through and take the cost and price for that?
Okay, before we come to the two final closing questions, possibly even three, just a question here from Leslie Bright around, which actually came right at the beginning of our session, which is around about war crimes prosecutions, and is this something which Germany is going to play? So you see Germany playing an active role in. Is this an area which we could feel quite comfortable playing a role in, given its traditional proclivities in terms of foreign policy, or is it something which will become subsumed in the greater change that is happening?
I think it's indeed a role where Germany can offer something. The documentation of the war crimes we have seen in Bucha is something where Germany has expertise, as I said earlier, from Rwanda or from the Balkans. Also in all those questions like transitional justice or things like that, Germany really has an expertise that can bring in. But what I would like to avoid is to say we can all do these things. We can do documentation of war crimes, and we can do humanitarian help and aid, and we can do the mapping of mines and all that. This is excellent and very good, and I would like Germany to do that. But it should not allow us to shy away from the other questions like war, like weapons delivery and energy. I understand from the German officials that an energy embargo is off the table, but then we should step up in the military realm with weapons delivery. Otherwise, we lose credibility.
Thank you. Okay, let's just come to the final questions here, and so we've got questions here from Jackie, who I say asked the easy question of how does it all end, but then also Paul. Hello, Paul. Nice to see you again. Paul Lever, who's asked about actually whether Germany is psychologically ready for a war that is likely to continue, or a state of conflict, if you like, and you referred to this as well, this confrontational world order as the new normal. To what extent is kind of Germany ready for this? And my final kind of question to you, which also follows on from Paul's question, is actually around the US, which is the thing we haven't really had a chance to discuss here, the relationship with the United States, and how that is, how obviously the importance of it, but also how that's likely to develop, given that a re-election of President Biden, or indeed another Democrat president in now just 2 years' time, cannot be taken for granted.
Let me start with the US question. The current crisis, from a German point of view, had a good message, and that the US is back in Europe. After the experience of the Afghanistan withdrawal of last summer, after the experience, a very painful experience of AUKUS in September, there was a certain fear that the transatlantic relationship would be a difficult one, that the US doesn't really care about European allies, is really focusing on Asia, and that we lack American leadership in Europe. And since the buildup of that crisis and the war last autumn, America was there, it was committed, it coordinated, and it was in a leadership position. All the things we missed in the Afghanistan withdrawal and in AUKUS. So this is to a large extent really good news for Germany and for Europeans. But on the same time, we also realized in that war that this is a European war. It's not an American war. So if you look, for example, to the State of the Union that President Biden gave, Ukraine comes up at the beginning, and the biggest part of the speech is about domestic politics, economics, and China. So the priorities haven't changed in the US, and this is something that makes European worry, because this current war in Ukraine shows us the big dependency we have in the defense area on the US in the conventional terms, but also in nuclear terms. To a large extent, NATO is safe because nuclear deterrence works. And nuclear deterrence works in two directions. It protects us, and it allows Russia to wage a conventional war in Europe, in Ukraine, without us intervening because of nuclear deterrence. So this war shows us Europeans, shows us Germans, how dependent we are on the US as our life insurance for European defense. And that raises the question again, is Trump the exception? And we have now pro-European presidents again? Or is Biden the exception? And after Biden comes another Trump. And if you think that question to the end, it raises again the whole debate about Europe's capacity to act. I could also say about European sovereignty, about European strategic autonomy. I don't care how you call it. It's about Europe being able to do more on its own. Europe being able to actually provide 50% of the capabilities we need for European defense coming from the Europeans, and rely a bit less on the Americans. One step in that direction, and we kind of do the circle, is spending more on defense, like the 2% Germany is going to spend, and the special budget. It's making homework. In the same time, we have to recognize if we do that, even in a serious way, it takes years. It takes years. It's not something that is going to change the 1st of July, 2023. So recognizing the dependence and recognizing that changing that dependence on a long-term perspective will only happen in a long-term perspective. Is Germany ready for this new confrontational security order? Is Germany ready for this permanent state of conflict? Not yet. I think it's really a mindset change that we need. Because we had many warnings. We had cyber attacks on the Bundestag. We had what we call in German the Tiergarten mord. So the murder in a park in the city center of Berlin, where Russian agents apparently killed oppositional people. We had Skripal, we had Navalny. So it's to a certain extent recognizing reality of contestation out of conflict. And this is a process that has to be supported also from the political level. So I think not yet, but we are getting there, hopefully, if this process is sustained. In an almost cynical way, I could add that Russia is doing its best to support that process if you see the pictures from Ukraine. But it's difficult to say that. So I think it's a process where we still have a kind of harsh learning curve in front of us. Jackie's question, I missed it. Can you remind me of Jackie's question?
Jackie just asked the nice easy one, basically. How does this war end, given that we risk total humiliation of a country with nuclear weapons? You've got about 2 minutes.
How this is going to end? I think in military terms, both countries can end it if they want to. The political conflict behind the military conflict is the whole question about the future of Ukraine. I think what we have learned over the last weeks is we can influence this war. With the sanctions, with the weapons delivery, with our unity, we were able to change the course of that war. Ukraine resisted far longer and far more powerful than everybody thought. So I think it's up to us to continue to influence the way the war develops. And we should not allow Russia to win that war first, but second, we should have a plan in our pocket to help Russia to rebuild afterwards.
Beautifully put. Thank you very much indeed, Claudia. And it only really remains for me to thank you for your time. I know how much in demand you are, and I've watched many clips of you on German TV, German talk shows. I particularly enjoyed the one where you schooled Klaus Wowereit, but I'll leave that one for people to dig out on Twitter. Thank you for taking the time, Claudia. I think it's been great. You've engaged very gamely with all of the questions which have been put, and I think have provided shone a lot of light in an area where there's actually quite a lot of heat going around. So thank you so much for that. Antonia, back to you.
My pleasure.
I can only really echo Simon's words. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us. And I can also just say that I feel like so much was covered in the hour that we had. So I'm really grateful on behalf of the BGA to both of you for participating. And thank you also to everyone in the audience for joining us tonight, for asking your questions. A recording of the event will be available on our website soon, so you will be able to revisit the conversation at a later stage, and encourage your colleagues, friends and family to do so too. And the BJ has several exciting events coming up, including our Parliamentary Day lunch on the 23rd of June with the Right Honourable David Lammy. Booking is already open for that event, so please make sure you check out our website, and you'll also see further information on other events coming up there too. So once again, thank you so much for coming this evening, and I hope you all have a good rest of the evening.